Well, hey there, welcome back. So, where we've got ourselves up to, Paul is now in Caesarea. So, if you remember, Caesarea is the capital of the Roman provincial region of Judea. As what has happened, Paul has been arrested in Jerusalem. They've charged him. They've tried to charge him with a variety of things, but now we're at the proper trial. We've got Paul standing in front of the governor and about to give his defense. And the difficulty at the moment for the governor is that he's got so many conflicting stories about what has actually gone wrong. So when Paul first arrived, he was accompanied by a Roman garrison to protect him, but also with a letter from Lysias back down in Jerusalem saying what Paul has been charged for. And if you remember, it was what we might call misinformation, but it was certainly misinformation in Paul's favor. What it had essentially said was that Lysias had gone down and rescued Paul from this violent mob that was trying to kill him, and that when he interrogated him and sent him to the Sanhedrin, all he could figure out was that this was a theological dispute. There was questions over the resurrection. There was questions over some sort of Jewish really religious dispute, but that was the best that he could find. In other words, he couldn't find anything wrong with Paul. The man's innocent as far as Lysias is concerned. And so for Felix, this seemed like a pretty easy situation. This is a pretty open and shut case that, all right, so this is maybe just a misunderstanding amongst the Jewish population, but he still needed to pay his due diligence, do his due diligence, which is to get the Jewish authorities up, the Sanhedrin to come up and to make their case against Paul. You know, they've got to do this thing properly. If only for his own position as governor, he needs to be seen to be upholding the authority of the local Jewish Sanhedrin, who are ultimately the ones that Rome is working through. Rome doesn't want to have a lot of hands-on politics and a lot of hands-on, certainly when it comes to the judicial system in the local regions. They'd much rather let the local authorities deal with that. So they're very happy for the Sanhedrin in this case, but he needs to do that due diligence and have the Sanhedrin come up and make their accusations against Paul. Well, anyway, they've turned up. The high priest has turned up. They've got a local lawyer, and the charges look very different to what to what he first heard. You've got these accusations that Paul is a troublemaker, that he's, effectively that he's an insurrectionist, and he stirs up riots all over the Roman world. This is a guy who, wherever he goes, trouble follows. This is just a terrible, terrible guy. And in other words, you've caught yourself a big one. This is a big threat to the empire. There's a promotion in this for you. Like, this is a big deal, this guy that you've caught. And that more than that, he's the ringleader of the Nazarene sect. So Felix would have some understanding of the local Jewish movements and the local Jewish population. And so by this stage, certainly Christianity would have become something of a known quantity. So they were still attached to Judaism in many ways, but there still would have been a recognition of a movement that's apart from the Jewish sects. And so what this has come to be known as is the Nazarene sect. In other words, they are attached to us very loosely on a couple of key things, like reading Torah, for example. But these guys follow that Nazarene teacher. In other words, Jesus, who was the great insurrectionist who ultimately was crucified. And so therefore, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You've got their teacher, their leader was an insurrectionist, was crucified. Well, look at your guy over here. This is the ringleader, not just some random member, but the head of the whole movement, which is actually not true. Everyone knows that the head of the movement is actually James, but let's not let the truth get in the way of a good story. Here's the ringleader. And so if the ringleader, if the head of the movement is an insurrectionist, how much more is this guy Paul going to be? So you've got yourself a big fish here, Felix. What are you going to do about that? Well, again, that completely contradicts everything that he's learnt so far about who Paul is, which is that this is just a guy who has a theological dispute. So he's trying to figure all of this out. So those are the charges that have been laid against him so far in this court case, and that's what we got up to last week. We've seen the prosecution and the charges that they're making against Paul. Well, obviously now it's Paul's turn to make a defense. He obviously gets to respond to these accusations, and certainly these false accusations that have been leveled against him. And so that is what he's about to proceed to do. So we'll pick up our story. It's Acts 24, verse 10. It says, "When the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, 'I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense.'" Now, this is an unusual move. Now, think about what has just happened with the accusers. They have gone and hired a local lawyer. And this Tertullus that we've met last week probably was a local lawyer from Caesarea. So somebody who is familiar with Felix, someone who would know the guy, and so there would be some familiarity there. And for the Jewish authorities, the Sanhedrin that have come up, and particularly for the high priest, it would be necessary for them to get a lawyer. One, because it shows that they've got somebody who is a respectable person, at least in the eyes of Felix, but also that they don't know the case. They're just sort of working on hearsay because they weren't there. They didn't see anything that Paul's been accused of doing. And for them, they're going to need somebody who can speak well, who can actually present a good case, because the reality is that they actually don't have a case. And as we saw with the accusations that have been made, the case is, well, it's false, what they're throwing against him. So they're really doing the best they can professionally to try to get this, to try to push this through. Whereas for Paul, it's a very different situation. Paul doesn't go and get a local lawyer. Now, the quick note with your lawyers here is that lawyers in the Roman world, they're not supposed to work for a fee. When you're a lawyer, you actually meant to work pro bono. You're actually meant to do this for free. But what that means, and we talked about this already, but what that means is, in theory, you're supposed to work for free, but the reality is going to be that that you're still going to expect something in return. You're going to expect that I've done you a favor, so you're going to give me something in return. It may not be a cash payment because technically I'm supposed to work for free, but the reality is that sometime down the line, I'm going to be asking you for a favor. And so typically your lawyers are going to represent powerful politicians and just high status elite citizens, usually just elite men. And what that means is they're going to have all of these men in their pockets. They're going to have all of these favors that are owed to them. So it is going to come back to them down the line. So even though technically lawyers are free, they shouldn't, everyone should be able to access them. The reality is going to be that they're still going to be very expensive at some point. And so in part, that's why Paul probably doesn't hire a lawyer, because, well, he doesn't have the funds to do that. But more than that, Paul can do the job himself. To be a lawyer, you need to be obviously educated, and the education required to do law is going to be an education in oratory, which is what all elite men receive. They all get trained and educated, and at the pinnacle of their education is oratory, because education leads to public life. Public life requires you to be able to speak. And so you need to have an education in oratory in order to be able to do that. But at the same time, what you need to have an education in is law. If you're going to lead your people, if you're going to lead a city, you need to understand its laws. You need to be trained in that. And so by virtue of being trained in the law, as well as being trained in oratory, you are a lawyer. That is what you do. In fact, what lawyers, the way that politicians make a name for themselves is in the law courts. Law courts are a public event. So when you think about, the Forum of Rome, the Forum of Rome had all of the public courts within the forum. They were all public events. They were part of the marketplace. It wasn't like something behind closed doors. The law, or the law courts, were something that were out there like stages in the forum that everybody walking past could go and see. And so you could go and watch a trial. It was just something that everybody could go and participate in, and it almost became a spectator sport, particularly when you've got a really good, talented lawyer giving a speech. That's entertaining. That's what people want to go and see. Or if it's a high profile case with some famous criminal, you want to go and see what's going on. And so what that means then is that these up and coming politicians, they want to take on these big cases. They want to get the best and the most famous and the most notorious cases, so that they're going to naturally draw a crowd to that. But then in addition to that, you're going to, by virtue of being the speaker at that, you're going to get this notoriety yourself. You're going to get this fame yourself, particularly if you're good. So politicians make their name this way. They use the law courts in order to do that. But again, what that requires is training. You need to be good at your craft. You need to be a great orator. You need to have gone through those years of training in order to do that. Well, Paul, to some extent, was educated. We don't exactly know the level to which he was educated in oratory, but we know that he studied with Gamaliel. He's already made that point, that he moved to Jerusalem in order to complete his education. So he was being trained under the greatest teacher of his generation and for generations to come. So he's already got a very, he's got a great knowledge. He's a very intelligent man, trained in Jewish law, but would certainly have an understanding of the law in general. But of course, what we're talking about here is Jewish law, because technically that's what the case is about. So he's already got that understanding, but at the same time, by virtue of being trained, by having this higher education, we would have to assume some level of rhetorical training. Paul would have to be able to be a public speaker of some sort, and we've seen this throughout his life. Paul is a preacher. That's what he does. His profession is preaching, and he's been pretty effective. So clearly he's got some skills in that region. So Paul is trained as a lawyer in that sense. Maybe he's not the best, maybe he's not as great as a Cicero or some of these great famous politicians / lawyers that we come across, but he's got some skills in this department. So he's got enough, he's confident enough in his own abilities to be able to speak for himself that he doesn't need to go and get a lawyer. He doesn't need that technical skill to assist him in the same way that many others would who don't have that sort of education. So that's working to his favor, and so he's going to draw on that. So even if at only a pragmatic level, this is going to save him some money or save him a favor down the line by not having to go and get a lawyer. But here's the more important point. Nobody knows his case better than he does. Right? He is the one who is on trial here. He knows what his defense is. He knows what it is that he hasn't done, and he certainly hasn't done what these people are accusing him of. So who knows him better than he does, and who can speak for him better than he can? He hasn't just got the skill to speak. He's actually got the story. He's actually got the evidence there for his innocence. And so for Paul, he's the most logical person to speak on his own behalf. And even more than that, when you consider that what Paul is actually being charged for is a theological dispute over the resurrection, well, who can speak better on the resurrection than Paul can? Because that's what this all comes down to. And Paul can very easily bring the charges back to the reality of the situation. And when we get it back to the reality of the faith, I can speak very, very confidently about that. If it happens to get to an opportunity to preach the gospel, nobody can do that better than I can. I am absolutely equipped to do that. So Paul defends himself very simply because he's the best person to do it. He doesn't need somebody else to come in and give him the support. And so that's what he proceeds to do. So he goes on, verse 11, "You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anyone else in the city, and they cannot to prove to you the charges they are now making against me." So Paul has just steamrolled over these accusations. The primary accusation is that Paul is a plague, that he's an insurrectionist, that he stirs up riots all over the Roman world. And what they're trying to do is lead with that, trying to make that the big deal, and then finish with, oh, and yes, he also desecrated the temple. But let's not worry about the desecration of the temple. Let's focus on the insurrection, because you, Felix, you're this great bringer of peace, and you do that through violence. And so what we want you to focus on is the fact that this is a great insurrectionist, and not just any old insurrectionist, but he is the ringleader of the most insurrection-y group that we've ever had walk in the streets of Jerusalem. So you've got your man here. Focus on that. And so Paul, in response, could say, well, hang on a second, I never started those riots. And if he gets dragged down into this mud fight, then it could become very messy. What they're trying to say is that Paul has started riots all over the Roman world. Paul's been involved in riots, obviously, and we read about some of those in Acts, including the one that we just saw in Jerusalem. But the truth is, Paul had nothing to do with those in the sense that he didn't start any of those. What they're trying to say is he began these riots, he's tearing cities apart. Yes, Paul was involved in them. He was involved in one back in Ephesus a couple of years ago, but he didn't start that. But if Paul was to get dragged down to that and try to make the case about the riots, then he would have to get into a fight of proving that he wasn't involved, that he didn't start it, and that he would be exactly where they want him. He would be admitting involvement in these riots, and it would be very hard for him to talk his way out of that. Even if it could be proven that he wasn't entirely guilty or that he was pretty much innocent of it, he's still involved, and they're still going to tarnish him. So Paul is really, really smart here. He just completely ignores all of that stuff, doesn't even mention it at all, and goes straight to the heart of the accusation, which is that he he desecrated the temple, that he was, he came in, he violated the temple, and that, that's what sparked this riot, and that's where all of this has got to. Paul goes straight to the actual case, which is the truth. This is what is actually there for. This is what started all of this, was this riot, was this, supposedly desecrating the temple. And so Paul goes directly to the heart of the issue. And so Paul can very, very easily respond to this with the truth that he was in Jerusalem, but he wasn't arguing with anybody, and he wasn't stirring up any trouble, and he certainly didn't bring any Gentiles into the temple. None of that is true. He was in Jerusalem doing nothing wrong. And if we want to get down to the weeds of it, what he was actually there in Jerusalem to do was to bring help for the poor. That's his ultimate purpose here. So even the accusation that he was stirring up trouble in Jerusalem, or that he was bringing a Gentile in, even that's not true. But it's so clever of Paul to bring it back to what is actually the focus of this trial, which is exactly what happened in Jerusalem. And he goes on to say, and they can't prove any of these other things, which is true. All of these accusations that Paul starts riots all over the world, they don't know that. How do they know what I've been doing around the world? They're making this stuff up as they go along. They can't prove any of that. So let's not even talk about that, because it's a frivolous argument. They can't even prove it. So, and in large part because it's not true. And so let's bring it back to the facts of what we're actually here for, to talk about what happened in Jerusalem. And what happened in Jerusalem, at least from my end, was nothing. I did nothing wrong. I was just minding my own business when all of a sudden these other clowns over here stirred up all of this problem. So very, very clever on Paul's part. If Paul's got any training as a lawyer, we're starting to see maybe a bit of that come through, in that he's able just to keep the focus of the trial on what the trial is there in the first place, and just not even engage with what are these false accusations. So it goes on, verse 14, however, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law, and that is what is written in the prophets, and I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. Now, this is where Paul is a genius. This is so clever what he does. Not only has he brought the focus of the trial back to Jerusalem, which is where it belongs, he's narrowing it down to what it is ultimately about, which is the theological dispute. That's the best that Felix has been able to determine so far from what he's heard from Lysias, is that it's the theological dispute. And so Paul is bringing it back to what that charge actually is. And so by bringing it back to that focus, this is really clever, because what it means is that he's able to bring his accusers along with him. So he says, all right, there's one thing that they said about me, is that I'm part of a group. And now they call it the Nazarene sect. What we call it is just the follower of the way. So yes, we are a group that is a part of Judaism. Yes, we are that. And I'll admit to that because it's true. They call it a sect. That's not our language, that's their language. And so if this is a semantic issue, well, then we just need to determine what we mean by a sect. But that's what they call it. We just simply call it, we are the true Judaism. But here's the core point. We all have the same beliefs. We all share the same law. We worship the same God, and we have the same hope in that God about a resurrection. So we actually all share the same beliefs. So the Jewish accusers are trying to separate Paul as being this violent insurrectionist that has nothing to do with them. Just the only thing we have in common is circumcision, but apart from that, everything else is different. No. We've got 99.9%. We are totally in alignment with everything that we believe. So whatever I believe, they believe. So if you don't like what I believe, then you're not going to like what they believe. The only point of difference we have is over the issue of the resurrection, but on every other point we agree. So I am completely in line with these guys in both of our shared worship and understanding of our God. And so because of that, I'm actually exactly like these guys. We all believe in a resurrection. We all believe that there'll be a judgment of the wicked and that there'll be a rising from the dead. We all believe in that. We have that shared belief. Again, the only key difference is that we believe it's through Jesus. They don't. That's the only point of difference, but upon everything else we agree. And so as a result of that, I strive to live a righteous life. I strive to live a holy life in the same way that these men do. So even in our practices, we're the same. Again, let's come back to the facts of the case, which you've already known about, Felix. You've already received that letter from Lysias. I know what the charges against me are. It's that we just have a different view on how the resurrection is going to come about. But again, apart from that, everything else is exactly the same. So this is brilliant on Paul's part. It's not just I'm not even going to enter into the mud fight of rioting all over the world. That is rubbish. They can't prove it. It's completely frivolous, these accusations. There's no evidence of that, and none of it is even true. The facts of the case are these, and so let's bring it back to the facts of the case. And what this all boils down to is that we are all exactly the same. All the men standing in front of you, we've all got the same beliefs, except on this point of Jesus Christ, and that's what this is all about. He goes on, verse 17, after an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. All right, so here's what I'm guilty of. I'm guilty of trying to keep a clear conscience. I didn't realize that was a crime. If it is, guilty as charged, but that's the best you got of me. The same way as these guys are trying to keep a clear conscience, so am I. That's what it is. But there's this other thing that I was doing. Let's focus on why I was in Jerusalem in the first place. Let's draw attention to that. Why was I here? I was here to bring gifts for the poor. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was a crime. If it is, guilty as charged, but there you go. So what are we here for? Well, first of all, I came to Jerusalem to bring gifts for the poor. Guilty. And then beyond that, I was walking around Jerusalem, minding my own business, and then all of a sudden I got dragged into this. If that's what I'm being charged for, guilty as charged. And then when it all boiled down to it, why they don't like me is because I have a different view of the resurrection. Again, if it's about having a belief in Jesus being the means of resurrection, guilty as charged. So, okay, you've got your man. I'm guilty of bringing money for the poor. I'm guilty of doing nothing wrong, of just walking around peacefully, and I'm guilty of believing that Jesus is the resurrection. If that's the case, great. All right. Lock me up. You've got me. But of course, none of that is a crime. But that's what we're here for, and what I'm here for is nothing. It's literally nothing. There is no crime that's being committed here. But that's what all of this is about. So even if they want to charge me with stirring up trouble in the temple, bringing in Gentiles, again, none of that is true. And even more than that, they can't prove that, because here's the reality. They weren't there. These men who are making these accusations weren't there. They didn't see any of this. There are no eyewitnesses here, as he goes on to point out in verse 19. He says, but there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. All those who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it was this one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you today. So here's a glaring oversight in all of this. It's the fact that the actual accusers are not present in the room. The people making the accusation have absolutely no idea what's going on. They're working on hearsay. Where are the actual accusers? The Asian Jews, the ones from Ephesus who supposedly saw me bringing this Gentile into the temple, and who themselves are actually guilty of starting the riot. Let's not forget that little detail. If they were here, you would actually have the ones who are guilty of whatever crime has happened. But again, where are they? How is this even a trial if we don't have the witnesses? What are we even doing here? Where you're literally trying to determine a case based on hearsay and charges made by people who've got nothing to do with the crime. This whole thing is a farce. This is a joke. Not only is it a ridiculous charge that's been brought against me, and well, what they're bringing against me is actually lies. I mean, we've got false accusations here. And then on top of that, not only can we not prove any of those things because they're not true, the actual things I am being charged for, the people who did see supposedly this thing that I was supposed to have done, even those guys aren't here. So again, what on earth are we doing here? This is just an absolute farcical of a situation. This whole thing is just ridiculous. In fact, because they're not here, this whole trial should be thrown out. We don't even have the proper witnesses. So if we're going to play properly, then really we should all just go home. There's not even a trial here. Or at the very least, go and get the people who are actually involved in this, and let's do this thing properly. But until then, we're not even doing this thing correctly here. And of course, Felix would be becoming aware of this. Surely by now, he would starting to realize that this whole thing is starting to fall apart. But then Paul says, all right, now let's really bring it down to the crux of the issue. What is it that I'm actually here for? Well, it's because of this thing that I said in front of the Sanhedrin. So and this actually is what lines up with the letter that Felix had first received, which is that when he stood before the Sanhedrin, he said, "Is because of the resurrection of the dead that I'm standing before you on trial today." That's what this is all about. Because again, if you think about the whole reason why they wanted to kill Paul in the first place is because he's an apostate. That he has a different view of the resurrection, that he's preaching Jesus, that makes him an apostate. That's why they want to kill him. This is just a convenient excuse to do that. And so what we are at the truth of what is going on. It is a difference in the resurrection, but also that the core case of this trial is about this. And Paul was able to establish that. That was what was so clever about what happened back in Jerusalem, is that Paul was able to establish through this meeting with the Sanhedrin that this is what you're here for. This is why you hate me. This is why we're having this disagreement, is about the resurrection. He was able to formally establish that. That was what was so clever about that proceeding, that he was able to move it from being an insurrectionist who Lysias was about to kill to being what the situation really was, which is a theological dispute, but to get that formalized, to get Lysias to recognize that that's what this difference is about, to put that in writing, because that letter that he writes, that's a formal document. That's a part of this case now. So the fact that it's written down, the actual charge is a theological dispute. What Paul's doing now is to bring it back to the facts of the case, which again is this theological dispute. So very, very clever on Paul's part, and to leave kind of that as the last thought. Whatever these false accusations are, no one is even here is able to prove that. But what I will admit to is what was said in the Sanhedrin, which you've already heard about. That's what we're all here for. So if that's a crime, well, then I'm guilty as charged. But obviously, it's not a crime. So again, what are we doing here? So verse 22, then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias the commander comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. So Felix is still in a bit of a state of confusion, right? He's heard this report from Lysias that this is just a theological dispute, and now the Jews have come along and said this is the world's worst insurrectionist. This is public enemy number one to Rome. Obviously, total opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of real charges. But now the defense that Paul has presented is to bring it back to the reality of the case, which is just this dispute in the Sanhedrin. So he's in all sorts. Felix is in all sorts here because, and the fact that he hasn't even got the actual accusers, the actual witnesses there in front of him. He's just working with people working on hearsay. So all of this is just working completely against Felix. He's really got no idea what's going on. So the best that he can do now is just to say, all right, well, I'm going to wait for my man Lysias to turn up, and hopefully he can give some clarity to this. Because at the end of the day, he's always going to put his faith back into his man Lysias. He's always going to trust the Roman who he's put in charge of these situations in the first place as being his most dependable witness in all of this case anyway. And we all know what Lysias is going to say when he gets there, which is to reaffirm that, hey, this was just a theological dispute. And even more than that, that's going to work in Paul's favor because Paul knows that he's got Lysias. Well, you know what? I mean, Lysias has nearly killed Paul, and so he's got that over. He's got that over him. So that's going to be a great outcome. However, what it means is that in the meantime, Paul's just got to wait around. So he's just got to hang around in Caesarea, stay there in Herod's palace until this trial can push forward and to eventuate. So he finishes this part of the story, verse 24. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about the faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, that's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I'll send for you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him there frequently and talked to him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. But because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. So the eventual outcome of this particular trial is really just a stalemate. Nothing actually comes of all of this. And what we see is just sort of Paul stuck in limbo. He doesn't actually even get to. He doesn't get to leave. He's stuck there for the next 2 years, and not in a formal prison, as we talked about early on in this series. He's not formally imprisoned in the sense that, well, we're going to lock you in jail for 2 years, but it's only that for the next 2 years, no one is willing to do anything about the case. And so Paul is just kind of stuck. He can't go anywhere because he still hasn't had a proper trial. He hasn't been found guilty or innocent of whatever the charges are. He's just got to kind of wait around for something to happen. Now, why didn't Lysias turn up? We don't know. We don't know what happened in these 2 years. The story just kind of sort of fades off at this point and gets picked up later on. Whatever the case is, Paul ends up here for 2 years. And really what we see happening here is the real Felix coming through. Felix, as if you remember, was a former slave. He's now a freedman. He's been appointed basically as a favor from the emperor, from Claudius, who would have been his patron. And what we know about Felix is that he wasn't the most sophisticated of men. Right? He was a slave. He didn't have the same sophisticated, high-level education that a typical senator would have. He's a bit more rough and ready. And so he's known for his very violent pacification of insurrectionists and for his corruption. He's just hoping that Paul will give him a bribe. And so he'd call Paul out. He's like, all right, Paul, let's have a conversation. Wink, wink. And Paul's like, oh, great. Okay, let me tell you about Jesus. No, not what I brought you here for. But, okay, well, while I've got you here, I may as well preach to you. So Paul's just constantly using these opportunities to preach to the governor, which would have been a great thing to happen. I mean, if you can convert the governor, that's going to make significant difference both to the region and also back in Rome when Felix eventually does go back to Rome. So anyway, Paul sees that as an opportunity to preach the gospel. Felix is like, you're missing the point here, Paul. If you just give me a bit of money, all of this can go away. We can just quietly send you away. And if anyone asks, we'll just say that you escaped during the night and we just didn't bother chasing you. Paul doesn't take the hint, or more likely, Paul's actually just got some integrity and he wants to get his day in court. Because, look, the reality is if Paul was to offer him a bribe, yeah, he'd be set free, but he'd never be able to be a public figure anymore. He'd never be able to go and preach and be the prominent apostle that he's called to be. He's always going to be on the run. So yes, he'd be free, but his ministry would be effectively disqualified as a result. So that's not something Paul could really do anyway. It wasn't really an option for him. Nevertheless, we've got this stalemate, 2 years, Paul's just waiting around. Now, presumably he's been looked after by some other believers. There's plenty of believers in Caesarea. That Caesarea was obviously very close to Jerusalem. It's going to have plenty of believers there and people that are friends with Paul. So he's getting support one way or the other throughout this time. So Paul's able to manage to survive that, and he's in the Herod's palace. So it's not a terrible situation. You can go and visit Herod's palace. It's still there in Caesarea Maritima. Beautiful ocean views. It's a lovely place, actually. So it wouldn't have been terrible circumstances, apart from the fact that for 2 years Paul just couldn't do anything. So it's probably, you can imagine Paul, who's just used to preaching every day to anyone who would listen. Now he's stuck in this house arrest, and the only audience he gets is Felix every couple of months when he gets pulled out to take a bribe. He's just got all this pent up preaching and evangelizing that he wants to get out of his system, and so Felix just cops the brunt of that. Well, I don't know, maybe that's what's happening. Anyway, as the story continues, we have a new governor. So Festus now, he's the new governor. He's coming to replace Felix. Felix is probably, thank God that I'm out of here. I can go back to Rome and put all of this a long distance behind me. This can be Festus's problem. And so Felix is probably good like that. He's just kind of held Paul, hasn't done anything about it. And so he's like, all right, wash his hands of that one. Festus, this is your problem. Now, of course, he would have briefed him on what the situation in Caesarea was. Certainly would have introduced him to Paul, told him what's going on there, because it's like, hey, why have I got this Jewish guy hanging around in the palace all day? Yeah, let me tell you about Paul. And so would have filled him in on that circumstance there, and it's like, by the way, that's your problem now. But anyway, I'm out of here. Festus, good luck. So as the story goes on, 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there. So your standard procedure when you arrive as a new governor is that you do a tour of the province, right? You don't just go to, in this case, Caesarea and put your feet up and, just carry on as you are. You go around and you build relationships with the local authorities. These are the people you need to work with. Remember, your job is to keep the peace and collect the taxes, but you're doing that through the local authorities. So the last thing you want to do is get those guys offside. So you're going to go around, you're going to hit the major cities, you're going to speak to the leaders, and you're going to make sure that you're on good terms with those guys. But more than that, it's not just about them doing your bidding. You're going to get something from these guys, right? You are going to become rich as a governor, and that's going to be through these authorities. So you want to make sure that you've got those guys working for you. Make sure that I scratch your back, you scratch mine, all the quid pro quos are set in place so that it's going to be a very fruitful time, especially for me, while I'm here. So absolutely, that's one of the key things you're going to do. So we see this already. 3 days after his arrival, he drops his bags, he's out of there, he's going down, and his first point of call is Jerusalem. So it's not just about building the relationships, but it's also about attending to any trials. Remember, the governor is the only person who has the authority of life and death. And so what he's going to do is that he's going to go and he's going to deal with these trials. So you've got to have plenty of people who've been held over in this transition period, because this is going to take a couple of months. There's going to be a transition period when the governor hasn't been visiting, to now have to come and deal with these particular cases. So that's what he's going to be doing. So this is a process that's going to be taking quite a while. And now, even more than that, in this particular situation, for the Jewish authorities, they've been holding off, right? After after that 2 years, they haven't forgotten about Paul. It's convenient that he's not out there preaching, that he's stuck in Herod's palace, but he's still a threat. And at any point, he still could be released, because they know he's innocent. I mean, everybody knows he's innocent. They're trying to make these false charges stick. If this actually comes to a proper trial, Paul's going to be set free, and we're going to have all of these problems again. So it's good so far in that he hasn't been able to, that he's been locked away, but we need to end him. And that wasn't going to happen under Felix, because Felix had come to a point of realization of, hey, this guy's done nothing wrong. So now they've got an opportunity, though. They've got this Festus who's just turned up to town, and he's the new governor. And as it says there, Festus wants to do them some favors. He wants to show them he's on their side. And so they're going to take advantage of that. And the first thing they're going to request is to have Paul tried properly, but not having tried in Caesarea on Roman terms, because remember, Paul's a Roman citizen, being tried by the governor is correct legally. They want him tried in Jerusalem because, well, one, if he makes it to Jerusalem, then he's going to be tried on our terms, and it's going to be a much better outcome for us. But really what we want is him killed. And that as they say, they're going to kill him along the way. They've got a plot in place that as they're bringing Paul down, they're just going to assassinate him. So that's what they're trying to, now of course they're going to tell him that part of the story, but they're going to take advantage of the new guy. They're going to use this new opportunity to say, all right, look, we can call in all our favors right now, bring Paul down, and you're going to have friends for life if you do that. Now, Festus can see right through this. He would have heard from Felix the details of the case. He knows how much the Jews hate Paul. He would at least be suspicious of something, clearly. And so he's not willing to do that. And he, of course, legally, they've got no right to call on Paul to come down to Jerusalem. It would only be as a favor to them that he would do that. But Festus is still, his priority is to look after a fellow Roman citizen, to uphold his responsibility to protect Roman citizens. So he can see through this. He's not going to let that happen. So he says, all right, look, if you want a trial, do it properly, come to Caesarea, and we can reopen the trial and we can have another go. And so that still is something of an opportunity for the Jewish people, because yes, Festus would have heard the details of the trial, but maybe they can make a fresh case. Maybe they've got fresh ears. He hasn't heard their original accusations that were made. It is a new opportunity. And maybe even if if he's still got a desire to help us and to do us a favor, that might just be enough that we can push him to do this thing that we want him to do, which is, of course, to have Paul killed. So verse 6, it says, after spending 8 to 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who'd come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought them many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. So in other words, what this is Luke's shorthand for it was the same as what we saw before. All the same speeches, all the same defense, same accusation, nothing has changed. So Luke doesn't need to repeat all the details of the story. And so it's just a quick summary of what we've already seen. They made many accusations. They couldn't prove any of them. And then Paul says, I'm innocent of everything they're charging me for. So it all came back to nothing again. We're right back to status quo. And here we are again, staring down the barrel of more time of Paul under house arrest until we can break this impasse. So the story goes on, verse 9. It says, then Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before them on these charges? Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. So when Paul makes his appeal to Caesar, what is actually going on here? What does that mean? What is he doing? Well, again, Paul is a Roman citizen, so we know that it's well established, and this is a particular privilege that Paul has as a citizen. So here he finds himself in the case of this trial where they want to bring him back to Jerusalem. Paul obviously knows what they're trying to do. They've got this assassination attempt lined up for the journey back. He knows that if he goes back to Jerusalem, he's a dead man. One way or the other, he's a dead man. The very fact that Festus wants to do a favor to the Jews, it's not going to end well for him if he goes to Jerusalem. So Paul just can't do that. That is not the outcome that he's looking for, but he's got this other trump card up his sleeve. He's got this one card that he can play that can not only avoid Jerusalem, but actually get him out of these circumstances altogether. And that is to make his appeal to Caesar. Again, a privilege that he has exclusively as a Roman citizen. Now, he could have played this at any time, but he doesn't until now, because the situation that he finds himself in now is a pretty dire situation. He's got two choices in front of him. The two choices are go back to Jerusalem and face inevitable death, or stay effectively under house arrest for as long as they keep dragging this thing out and go nowhere, basically be stuck in Caesarea for potentially the rest of his life, because we need to have a proper trial and I need to be found to be innocent to be able to be set free to carry on the ministry work that I'm called to. I can't just escape, so I've got to do this thing properly, but nothing has happened in Caesarea. Now, so those are the two options that are in front of him, except that now this third option that's always been there, but it's not one that he's wanted to play to this point because it comes at a cost. But realizing now that really the other two choices are just not good options for him, it's time to play this. It's time to play his trump card. It's time to play this card that he has, which is to make his appeal to Caesar. So what is the appeal? What is this that Paul is doing? Well, this appeal to the emperor dates back to the very, very early days of the Republic. So when Rome was set up, it was set up after they got rid of their last kings. They set themselves up with a senate. So they have a political body rather than a monarch who's ruling over Rome. Now, this senate is made up of 100 elite men, and it's their job to make political decisions, to make decisions of war, basically do the job that the king used to do, but now the job is divided up amongst the senators. So rather than have one person who just arbitrarily does whatever he decides to do, make up laws as he goes along, and basically do everything that's going to favor him, we've got rid of that now. We don't want to have a king again. We're going to have this senate. The senate is going to be the body that does all of that, that's going to rule us now. The problem, however, is that the senate consists of the patrician class, the elite class, the patrias, the fathers of Rome. Now, this is where we get our word plebs from. So the patricians are the upper class. They're the elites. They're the wealthy landowning men. The plebeians are the commoners. They're the everybody else. They're the ones who don't have that patrician status. So it's where we get our word plebs from. The everyday, the common person is what it's referring to. Well, anyway, that's a reasonably good way of doing politics. It's a good way to run a city. I mean, we still draw on that with the modern Western democracies. We still have senates and we still have these body of representatives who make decisions on behalf of all of us. So that's what the Romans have set up. The problem is that they're still corruptible. The problem is that the senators are still just going to do what the senators want to do. Even though they can't just have one person making all the decisions, they're still going to be doing things that favor them. And for the plebs, they don't have a voice. They can't be represented in the Senate. They can't go and run for an election to be in the Senate. So they're still reliant on these people who are not always the best, they're not always the most clean and the most good conscious people. So you're still going to have these situations for the plebs where they're being walked over, but they're being trampled on by their representatives, by their senators. And so after a while, when all of this corruption just continues to grow and to just become more and more intolerable, eventually the Roman people just say, in about the 4th century BC, they turn around and they say, you know what, we're out of here. We're done with Rome. You guys want to have Rome? That's fine. Have at it. We're going somewhere else. So all of the citizens of Rome just threaten to up and leave. And so that's a bit unprecedented. And if they do happen to up and leave, there will be no Rome. You can be the senators, but the senators of nothing because there's no citizens there. So they realize, okay, these guys are actually serious. They're going to move. They're going to go to surrounding cities. They're going to become citizens of other places. We won't have a Rome left. This won't end well for us. And so they come to a compromise. They realize, all right, we need to take the plebs seriously. We need to give them something to show them that we're respecting their voice and we want to hear from them as well. And so what they establish in this void between the plebs and the senators is a new office called the Tribune of the Plebs. So literally the people's tribune. And the job of the tribune of the plebs is to speak on behalf of the plebs. So this is an elected office. You are elected from the plebs. You can't have a patrician class person becoming a tribune of the plebs because they're just going to work for the patricians and the senators. It needs to be a representative of the people. So you are elected into this role. You hold that for 1 year, and it is your job to speak on behalf of the people. Now, one of the most important powers you have as a tribune of the plebs is the power of the veto. Now, this is a word you know from modern politics, veto, which just simply means I forbid. It's just the Latin for I forbid. They have the power of veto where if they can stand in the Senate, and if the Senate is trying to pass a law that is not going to be favorable to the people, they can veto it. They can say, nope, we're not going to have that because that's not going to be beneficial for us. So this is an extraordinarily powerful, influential position and very important for the people to have, because what it also means is that if any of the plebs ever find themselves in a situation where they're being falsely charged by a senator, or where there seems to be some sort of oppression, something that's going against them unfairly, they can make an appeal to the tribune of the plebs. They can make an appeal to the people. Literally, I appeal to the people. And in doing that, they can... any proceedings stop, any charges are sort of put on hold, and they can get represented by the tribune of the plebs who can step in and mediate in the situation. So a very, very important role that we find getting set up several hundred years before, certainly before Paul's time. When we move into the Roman Empire, though, when we start to get emperors, and the first one being Augustus, the way that Augustus became the emperor, there was no position called the emperor. He just took all the powers for himself. He didn't formalize himself and say, I'm going to be the emperor and I'm going to be in charge of everything. Just over time, he gradually took on the offices that were normally given out to senators and to the other people. So, for example, the high priesthood. Well, he became the high priest. So that's not an option anymore for anyone else. He becomes the high priest. He also becomes the head of the army. So now he's in charge of the army. He's in charge of all of the religious cults. So he's gradually accumulating power for himself that would normally be divided up amongst the Senate so as that we don't get a monarch. So very slowly over time, he's just becoming more and more of a monarch. And one of the roles that he takes on is the tribune of the plebs. So that used to be, again, still from someone from the plebeian class. Well, now he's taken that on for himself amongst his many other powers. So what used to be I appeal to the people, I appeal to the tribune of the plebs, now becomes I appeal to Caesar. So the power is still there. The option is still there for a Roman citizen to make that call to the emperor, to make that appeal. Only now it's a direct appeal to the emperor rather than to a political seat, which is the tribune of the plebs. Now it's directly to the emperor, who in this case is the Emperor Nero. Now you might say to yourself, that sounds like a good option. Why didn't Paul just do that right from the very start? I mean, just appeal to Caesar, have his case heard there, and then all of this goes away. Well, here's the catch. Paul has every right to make an appeal to Nero in this case. Sure, not a problem at all. But he's got to get himself there. He's got to find passage from Caesarea over to Rome, and that's going to come at a cost. That's going to be several weeks at least of traveling that he has to pay for. He's going to have to bring witnesses, of course. He's got to bring people that can defend him, and so he's going to have to pay passage for those. There's no money for this. There's no state funds that anyone can appeal to Caesar and we're going to pay for it. No, you can make that appeal. That's well within your rights. You've just got to make it happen, though. So Paul's going to have to pay for that passage to do that, and then that just takes time. Paul doesn't have the time to just be hanging around in Rome if he doesn't have to. But he realizes that this is the only choice he has, so he's going to have to pay passage to Rome. And then when he gets to Rome, there's no guarantees he's going to have a chance to speak to Nero straight away. That could take weeks, months, years even, because Nero's a busy man. Nero's got a whole empire to run. The last thing that Nero's got time for is to mediate between a theological dispute. Some Jewish preacher that says that Jesus came back to life. That's what this is about. That's kind of ridiculous. So for Paul, he doesn't know how long it's going to take. When he gets to Rome, he could be there for quite a while. And while he's there, he's got to support himself. He's got to find a place to live. He's got to find accommodation. He's going to be under arrest of some description, and he's going to have to feed himself. You don't get fed by the jailers. If you're under arrest, you've got to take care of yourself. You need people, outsiders, who are capable of supplying your needs, primarily food, or in Paul's cases, we're going to see, paying rent. So every day of this is going to come at a cost. Paul is going to have to find the finances in order to do this, as well as the time that is taken out of his life to actually go through with this whole procedure. Because if he makes that appeal to Caesar, he has to go and stand in front of Caesar. And again, that could take months, and that's going to be very expensive. So Paul has held off doing this. Yes, it seems like an easy option, but actually in reality, it's a very expensive, very time-consuming process that Paul would just rather avoid. What he would prefer to have is all of this case dropped, all of these charges be put aside. That's not going to happen. In fact, what it's looking like is that if we keep going the way we are, I'm probably going to get assassinated. That's not a good outcome. Better to be at least, paying money to stay alive and maybe preach to the emperor than it is to be dead. So it's his best option, but it's a hard one. But he's pushed into a corner. This is the best that he's got. Well, this is the call that he has to make. So at any rate, Paul makes his appeal to Caesar, and Festus confers with his council, and they realize, yep, all right, that's within his rights to do that. You've made your appeal to Caesar you shall go. Here's the problem. What is he guilty of? We're going to send this guy to Nero, to the emperor, to the king of the world. This man is about to go and stand trial before him, and I am going to be the one sending him. I am the governor who is going to be sending Paul along, and I need to send him along with some legitimate charges. Now, the sort of crimes that you can imagine the emperor deals with are serious, high-level cases of insurrection. We're about to send a guy who is here because he has a dispute with his fellow Jews over whether Jesus is the Messiah or the resurrection. This is not going to end well unless we can find something better to charge this guy with, something better to send to the emperor. So what we need to do now is rally to figure out what can we send to the emperor that's going to make sense and that's not going to make us look like total idiots. We need to figure this thing out. So next week in our last episode, we're going to look at what happens next, how it is that Paul gets to Rome, and, well, what happens when he gets there. Anyway, otherwise have a great week, and I will see you next week.